Samuel Vale came back to Kansas expecting to sell the old straw bale cabin his father had died defending. Instead, he found Warren Vale standing inside it with a demolition order folded in one hand and a mocking smile on his face. The cabin that had survived more than a century of wind, snow, and neglect was about to be torn down as if it were nothing. Yet the moment Samuel stepped inside, he felt something strange. The walls seemed to be hiding more than straw and clay. And before the day ended, he would find a secret his family had buried for generations. Welcome to today's story. If you enjoy emotional drama and shocking twists, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. And before we begin, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. But the truth began long before Samuel ever left Kansas. The wind rolled across Cedar Draw exactly the way Samuel remembered, dry, restless, endless. He parked his pickup beside the old straw bale cabin and sat behind the wheel for a moment without moving. Peter Vale had been gone for 3 weeks. 3 weeks since the funeral. 3 weeks since Samuel had stood beside the grave feeling more confused than heartbroken. Grief was difficult when years of distance had settled between father and son. The cabin stood alone against the prairie. Its plaster walls were faded, the roof sagged slightly. Grass had grown around the stone foundation. From a distance, it looked exactly like the kind of place people laughed about in town. And for years, Samuel had laughed too. Not openly, not cruelly, but he had believed the story everyone did. Peter Vale had inherited worthless land. He had wasted decades defending a failed homestead. He had chosen stubborn pride over common sense. At least that was what Caleb Vale's side of the family had repeated for years. Samuel opened the truck door and stepped into the cool afternoon air. The property was his now. There wasn't much left to settle. A few acres, some old records, the cabin. Selling it seemed like the simplest solution. A voice interrupted his thoughts. "About time you got here." Samuel turned. Warren Vale stepped out through the cabin doorway carrying a clipboard, Caleb's grandson. Tall, confident, and wearing the same expression Samuel had seen on members of that side of the family his entire life. The expression of someone who already believed he owned the room. Warren held up a document, County Inspection Report. Samuel took it. Unsafe A structure, potential collapse risk, recommended removal. Samuel frowned. The county inspected this? Last month. Warren shrugged. Honestly, it's overdue. Nobody wants to see this thing fall on someone. The words irritated him immediately. Nobody lived here. Nobody visited, and yet Warren seemed unusually eager to see it disappear. "You already hired a demolition company?" Samuel asked. "Just preparing for the future." The answer came too quickly. Samuel folded the paper. "Nothing's being demolished today." Warren smiled. "Suit yourself." Then he looked around the property. "My grandfather always said Peter should have sold this place while he had the chance." Samuel felt his jaw tighten. Warren noticed and smiled wider. "Guess stubbornness runs in the family." Without another word, he climbed into his truck and drove away. Dust lingered behind him long after the vehicle disappeared. Silence returned. Samuel looked back at the cabin. For a moment he considered leaving. Instead, he walked inside. The familiar smell hit him immediately. Dust, clay, old wood. Something else too. Something surprisingly dry and clean. The interior should have felt ruined. It didn't. The air was cool despite the afternoon heat. The walls felt solid. The floor remained level. Samuel slowly ran his hand across the plaster. His work overseas had taken him through centuries-old structures, abandoned churches, stone cottages, historic farmhouses. He knew deterioration when he saw it, and this cabin wasn't behaving like a dying building. That bothered him, because it contradicted everything he thought he knew about Peter. He walked slowly through the main room. A cracked thermometer still hung near the door. An old table sat against one wall, shelves lined another. Then he stood north wall. Something felt different. His fingers moved across the plaster again. Tap, 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 solid. Tap, hollow. Samuel froze. He stepped back, then leaned closer. The hollow section wasn't large. Maybe the size of a notebook hidden behind layers of old plaster. His pulse quickened. Carefully, he retrieved a small utility knife from his pocket. The outer clay crumbled easier than expected. A few minutes later, a small cavity appeared. Inside rested a bundle wrapped in dark oilcloth. Samuel stared at it. Nobody accidentally hid something like that. He pulled it free. The cloth crackled with age. Dust drifted into the air. His hands moved carefully as he unfolded the package. A single paper lay inside, yellowed, fragile, covered in familiar handwriting, Amos Vale. Samuel recognized it immediately from the old family ledger stored in Peter's house. His eyes moved down the page. Weather notes, boundary references, short observations. Then 3 lines caught his attention. North Rise remains safest in winter. Watermark must not be moved. Caleb must never alter the survey. Samuel's stomach tightened. He read the lines again and again. None of it made sense. Why would Amos write something like that? Why hide it inside a wall? His eyes drifted toward the bottom corner. A page number sat there in faded ink. For several long seconds he simply stared. Then memory hit him. The family ledger, the copy Peter kept. The one Samuel had glanced through after the funeral. It jumped from page 46 directly to page 49. Pages 47 and 48 were missing. And now one of them had just emerged from inside the wall of a cabin everyone claimed was worthless. Samuel looked around the silent room. For the first time all day, selling the cabin no longer felt simple, because somebody had hidden page 47, and somebody had wanted it to stay hidden forever. Samuel did not leave the cabin immediately. He stood in the dim room with page 47 resting on the old table, afraid to touch it again and afraid not to. The wind pressed softly against the north wall, moving around the cabin instead of through it. That bothered him more than it should have. Warren's report called the place unsafe, but Samuel had worked inside buildings far weaker than this. He knew the difference between neglect and collapse. This cabin had been neglected. It had not surrendered. He took photos of the page before the light faded, then he wrapped it again in the oilcloth and placed it inside a flat document sleeve he kept in his truck. He had brought the sleeve for sale papers, not evidence. The thought left a bitter taste in his mouth. Back at Peter's house, the old family ledger sat in a cardboard box near the kitchen door. Samuel had almost thrown it away 2 days earlier. It was heavy, stained, and full of figures that had meant nothing to him then. Rainfall, wind direction, feed use, cold snaps. Short notes written in a careful hand by Amos Vale and later by Peter. Now the book felt different. Samuel laid it on the kitchen table and opened to the section he remembered. Page 46 ended with an entry about early frost along Cedar Draw. Page 49 began with a note about moving cattle away from the low ground. The paper edges between them were uneven, not torn cleanly, but removed with enough care that someone had wanted the damage to look old. He placed page 47 beside the ledger. The handwriting matched. The ink had browned the same way, but the missing space seemed louder than the words themselves. Samuel leaned back in the chair and rubbed both hands over his face. He had crossed oceans to study old buildings for strangers. He had measured cracked stone, catalogued water damage, and written reports about structures no one in his own family would ever see. Yet here, in his father's kitchen, he had nearly missed the only building that might have mattered. Peter had tried to tell him once, not about the page, not directly. Years earlier, during one of their last tense calls, Peter had said, "A wall remembers what men try to forget." Samuel had thought it was another one of his father's stubborn sayings. Another way to avoid talking honestly. He had changed the subject. Then the calls became shorter. Then they stopped being calls and became holiday messages that arrived late and sounded tired. Now Peter was gone and the wall had spoken first. The county records office opened at 9 the next morning. Samuel was waiting outside at 8:52, holding the ledger, the recovered page, and a folder of photographs. The building sat on Main Street, plain brick, low roof, no drama. The kind of place where history sat in boxes until someone needed it badly enough to ask. Inside, the air smelled of paper, dust, and copier toner. A woman behind the counter looked up from her computer. She was in her late 40s with silver beginning at her temples and reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. "Can I help you?" "I hope so," Samuel said. "I'm looking for probate records connected to the Vale homestead. Amos Vale, late 1880s. The woman studied him a little longer after hearing the name. "You're Samuel." He nodded. "Peter's son." Her expression softened, but only slightly. "I'm Marin Cole. Your father used to come in here every few months." Samuel stiffened. "For what?" "Mostly copies. Old maps, weather records. Sometimes he just sat with the probate books." She paused. "He never caused trouble, no matter what some people said." That landed harder than Samuel expected. He looked down at the folder in his hands. I found something in the cabin wall. Marin did not reach for it right away. That, more than anything, made Samuel trust her a little. She glanced toward the back room, then lowered her voice. Come around to the side table. Samuel followed her to a work area near the archive shelves. He laid out the photographs first, then the ledger, then the recovered page. Marin put on cotton gloves before touching anything. Her face changed as soon as she saw the page number. 47, she murmured. You knew pages were missing, I suspected. She opened the ledger carefully and turned to the gap. Your father asked about them more than once. The copy submitted into probate years ago had the same break. Submitted by who? Marin looked at him. Caleb Vale's line held most of the family papers when the county started collecting historical records. That doesn't prove anything by itself. Samuel heard the caution in her voice. He respected it, but it frustrated him anyway. What does prove something? Not one page, she said. Not by itself. You would need comparison copies, supporting records, survey maps, receipts, maybe independent notes if anyone else wrote about that winter or that land. A single hidden page raises questions. It doesn't answer them. Samuel stared at the words again. North Rise remains safest in winter. Watermark must not be moved. Caleb must never alter the survey. Then help me find the questions, he said. Marin held his gaze for a moment. Whatever she saw there made her nod. She disappeared into the archive room and returned with 2 bound volumes and a folder of microfilm printouts. For the next hour, they moved through the past one document at a time. Amos Vale's estate inventory was there. So was the property transfer summary. The official description of Peter's tract was brief and brutal. Northern dry parcel, limited improvement value, no confirmed water claim. Samuel read it twice. That matches the family story, he said quietly. It matches the filed story, Marin corrected. She slid another paper toward him. It was a copy of the historical plaque application from decades later. Caleb's descendants had sponsored it. The text described Peter's straw bale cabin as a curiosity of frontier poverty, built by necessity on marginal land after an unequal but lawful inheritance. Samuel felt heat rise in his chest. Unequal but lawful. The phrase sounded polished, respectable, final, and cruel. That plaque is still out by the county road, Marin said. Your father hated it. Samuel remembered passing it the day of the funeral. He had not stopped. He had barely looked at it. Marin turned another page. Here. It was a weather record copied from Peter's continuation of Amos's ledger, February 1888. Outside temperatures far below zero, inside readings that should not have been possible inside a pile of straw and clay. Samuel leaned closer. Peter had recorded everything. Wind direction, fuel use, wall condition, roof repairs, interior temperature, not once, again and again. This is real, Samuel said. Yes, Marin answered. But it was treated like family oddity. Your father wanted it catalogued as early straw bale construction. Caleb's side preferred folklore. Samuel looked at the ledger. For the first time, he saw the pages not as old numbers, but as a man trying to make the truth measurable because no one believed his word. A bell chimed near the front door. Marin straightened. Samuel turned. Warren Vale stepped into the records office with a manila envelope tucked beneath his arm. His eyes moved from Samuel to the ledger on the table, then to Marin's gloved hands. His smile disappeared. Well, Warren said, voice smooth but tight. That didn't take long. Samuel closed the ledger slowly. Warren walked closer and placed the envelope on the table. I came to save you some trouble. Samuel did not touch it. What is it? A quitclaim package. Fair offer. More than that cabin and scrub ground are worth. Warren's gaze dropped to the old page inside the sleeve. You sign, you walk away clean. No restoration bills, no county headaches, no embarrassing fight over a building your father should let fall years ago. Marin said nothing, but her eyes sharpened. Samuel looked at Warren, then at the envelope, then back at the ledger. A day earlier he might have taken the offer. Now it felt like a hand closing around his throat. How did you know I was here? Samuel asked. Warren's smile returned, but it was thinner now. In this county, he said, Vale business never stays quiet. He tapped the envelope once with 2 fingers. February changes a man's mind, Samuel. So does debt. Then he turned and walked out. The bell over the door rang again. The records office fell silent. Samuel looked down at the documents spread across the table. His father's ledger, the hidden page, the plaque application, the probate copy. Marin was still watching the door. After a moment, She reached for one more folder from the stack. "I wasn't going to pull this until we knew what we were looking for," she said. Samuel turned toward her. She opened the folder and removed a small yellowed receipt. The date was 3 days before Amos Vale's estate reading. The payer's name was Caleb Vale. The recipient was a county surveyor. Samuel left the records office with copies of everything Marin could legally provide that day. The surveyor receipt sat on top of the stack, protected inside a plastic sleeve. It wasn't proof of fraud. Not yet, but it was proof of something. Caleb Vale had paid a surveyor 3 days before Amos's estate was divided. That fact alone refused to leave Samuel's mind. The afternoon sun hung low as he drove west toward Cedar Draw. Dust rolled behind the truck. The prairies stretched outward in every direction, flat enough to make a man feel exposed. For years Samuel had believed the story everyone told. Peter inherited poor land because life wasn't fair. Caleb inherited the better farm because he was more practical. End of story. Now that story had cracks, and every new document seemed to widen them. Back at Peter's house, Samuel spread copies across the kitchen table. The room felt smaller than he remembered. The same coffee stains marked the wood surface. The same worn curtains hung over the sink. The same silence filled the corners, except now the silence felt crowded. Amos, Peter, Caleb, all of them seemed present in the paper scattered before him. Samuel studied the surveyor receipt again. The name at the bottom read Nathaniel Griggs, county surveyor, retired decades ago. Dead nearly 20 years. No direct answers waiting there, only another trail. He pulled out his laptop and began searching public records, land transfers, historical surveys, property descriptions, anything connected to the Vale acreage. Hours passed. Darkness arrived outside. The kitchen light remained on. Finally a pattern emerged. The legal descriptions attached to Peter's land appeared unusually brief. The language lacked detail, especially regarding water access. Samuel frowned. Out west water mattered, sometimes more than the soil itself. No surveyor accidentally ignored water. He made a note, then another, and another. Near midnight his phone rang. "Marin, sorry for the hour," she said. "You found something, I found someone." Samuel sat up straighter. Marin continued. "There was an old land agent named Walter Finch, retired, lives outside Dodge City now. He handled private map collections after the county archives declined them." "What does that have to do with Griggs?" "A lot of surveyors sold copies to private agents when they retired." Samuel's pulse quickened. "You think Finch has something?" "I think if a clean copy of a boundary map exists, he'd know where it ended up." The call lasted only a few minutes, but it changed everything. The next morning Samuel headed east before sunrise. Finch's property sat outside town behind rows of cottonwoods and rusting farm equipment. The retired land agent looked older than Samuel expected. Thin, sharp-eyed, suspicious. The kind of man who spent decades protecting records nobody else cared about. When Samuel explained why he came, Finch didn't invite him inside immediately. Instead he stared. Long enough to make Samuel uncomfortable. "You're Peter's boy." Samuel nodded. Finch looked away toward the fields. "Your father came here once." The statement surprised him. "When?" "Years ago." "What happened?" The old man shrugged. "I told him the same thing I'm about to tell you." He opened the door. "Some people bury bodies. Rich families bury paper." Inside, shelves filled nearly every wall. Maps, survey books, property ledgers, rolled documents tied with fading ribbon. Finch moved slowly but confidently. He knew exactly where everything lived. After nearly an hour, he carried 2 large map tubes to a table. One looked newer. The other was stained and fragile. Samuel carefully unrolled both. At first glance, they appeared identical. Same boundaries, same acreage, same survey markings. Then he noticed the creek, or rather the difference. The stained draft map showed Cedar Draw's seasonal water route crossing near the northern rise. The cleaner version shifted the route noticeably south, not dramatically, just enough. Enough to change value, enough to change access, enough to change how inheritance might be viewed. Samuel stared at both maps. His conservation work had trained him to notice alterations, layers, corrections, things hidden in plain sight. The clean copy felt wrong, not forged, edited. Finch pointed toward a notation near the corner. Draft came first. His finger moved toward the cleaner version. This came later. Samuel swallowed. Who requested it? Finch didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into a folder and produced an invoice copy. A name appeared beside the order, Caleb Vale. For several seconds neither man spoke. The room suddenly felt warmer. Not because the evidence solved anything, because it connected the missing ledger page, the surveyor payment, the altered map, separate pieces, same direction, same beneficiary. Samuel carefully photographed everything. Finch allowed copies but refused to release originals. Paper doesn't accuse people, the old man said. People do that. Paper only survives long enough to be read. By afternoon, Samuel returned to Cedar Draw. Word traveled faster than he expected, much faster. When he stopped at the general store for gas and coffee, conversations went quiet. People watched him, some openly, others through reflections in windows. Near the counter, two men exchanged grins. "Beggar's barn still standing?" one asked. Laughter followed. Samuel ignored it. Then another voice spoke. "Careful. He's trying to prove the straw house is a palace." More laughter. Not cruel. Worse. Casual. Generational. The kind of mockery repeated so often people forgot where it started. Samuel paid for his coffee and left. Outside, he sat in the truck longer than necessary. The embarrassment surprised him. He wasn't Peter. The jokes weren't about him, yet somehow they were. For the first time he understood what his father must have endured. Not one insult. Thousands. Spread over decades. He drove directly to the cabin. The evening light painted the plaster walls gold. The structure stood exactly where it always had, quiet, unapologetic. Samuel walked around the foundation, examining details, studying repairs, looking at things he had once dismissed. Near the back entrance he noticed something tucked beneath a loose board inside a storage shelf. A folded paper. Yellowed, fragile, he carefully unfolded it. The handwriting belonged to Elena, his mother. Only one sentence appeared. "Your father knows where the wind will stop." Nothing more. No explanation. No date. Just the sentence. Samuel sat on the porch steps holding the note. The words sounded simple, but they hit harder than expected. Peter had spent years measuring wind, tracking cold, recording temperatures, studying survival. Maybe the cabin had never been about stubbornness. Maybe it had always been about knowledge. The thought stayed with him long after sunset. Darkness settled over Cedar Draw. The prairie became silent except for distant insects and moving grass. Samuel made one final walk around the cabin before heading home. His flashlight swept across the north wall, then stopped. A section of plaster near the base looked different. Fresh, too fresh. He crouched lower. Tiny fragments of clay rested beneath it, recently disturbed. His beam moved closer. The damage resembled rodent activity at first glance, except the opening was unnaturally clean, almost cut. Samuel reached out and touched the edge. The material crumbled between his fingers. Someone had been inside this wall, recently, very recently. Then his light caught something else, a narrow slice through an old rawhide binding buried beneath the plaster. Not weather damage. Not age. A knife mark. Samuel froze. Someone wasn't trying to get into the cabin, someone was trying to get into the wall. Samuel stayed crouched beside the north wall for nearly a minute, staring at the clean cut in the rawhide binding. The damage wasn't old, it wasn't accidental, and it wasn't the work of mice. Someone had opened the wall after Peter's death. The realization settled heavily in his chest. Whoever had done it either knew something was hidden inside the cabin, or had been searching for something they believed existed. Neither possibility made him feel better. He took photographs from every angle before touching anything else. The flashlight revealed more details as he worked. Tiny fragments of plaster lay beneath the opening. A few pieces were still lighter than the surrounding wall, suggesting they had been exposed only recently. The cabin had survived more than a century, yet someone had chosen this exact moment to cut into it. Samuel drove home after midnight and emailed every photograph to himself, then uploaded copies to cloud storage. He was no lawyer, but he knew enough about documentation to protect evidence before someone questioned it later. He barely slept. At dawn he called Marin. "Don't touch anything until I see it," she said immediately after hearing his description. By noon she arrived at Cedar Draw carrying a camera, gloves, and a notebook. The two of them examined the wall together. Marin studied the opening for several minutes before speaking. "That's not rodent damage," Samuel almost laughed. "You're confirming what I already hoped wasn't true." She pointed toward the cut. "The edge is too clean. Something sharp went through here." Samuel leaned against the wall. "Can we prove when?" "Probably not exactly." The answer frustrated him. But we may be able to show it happened recently. Maren carefully photographed every layer. Then she stepped back. Has Warren been inside since Peter died? Samuel thought about it. He's been here at least twice. Alone? Sometimes. Maren didn't respond immediately. Neither of them wanted to make accusations they couldn't support. Not yet. Outside, a pickup truck appeared at the end of the road. Samuel recognized it instantly. Warren. The truck stopped beside the cabin. Warren climbed out carrying a folder. His eyes moved from Samuel to Maren and finally to the damaged section of wall. For a fraction of a second, something flashed across his face. Recognition. Then it disappeared. What happened here? He asked. The question sounded too casual. Samuel crossed his arms. You tell me, Warren laughed. I just got here. Funny timing. Warren's smile faded. I came because the county received a nuisance complaint. Samuel frowned. What complaint? The cabin. Warren held up paperwork. Structural safety concerns. Maren looked at him sharply. You filed it? I reported damage. His answer came quickly. That's what responsible property owners do. Samuel took the papers. Emergency review request, potential hazard inspection, county action pending. The timing felt almost perfect. Someone cuts into the wall. Damage appears. A complaint follows. All within days. Maren saw the same pattern. You reported the damage before an inspector saw it, she asked. Warren shrugged. I don't need permission to protect neighboring properties. The statement sounded polished, prepared. Samuel felt anger rising. Not explosive anger, the quieter kind. The kind that forms when someone keeps treating lies as common sense. The cabin stood for over 100 years, he said. And now suddenly it's an emergency? Warren's expression hardened. Sometimes old things reach the end. Samuel looked at the wall, then back at Warren, or someone helps them. Silence followed. Warren broke eye contact first, not enough to prove guilt. Enough to notice. The conversation ended shortly afterward. Warren drove away. Maren remained standing beside the wall. He knows something. Samuel exhaled slowly. So do we. That afternoon, Samuel made a decision. He wasn't going to sit and wait for county inspectors to decide the cabin's fate. If the building was becoming evidence, it needed protection. The next several days became a race. Samuel reviewed Peter's notes. Not every page, only the sections describing maintenance, drainage, plaster repairs, foundation protection. For years he had dismissed those records as obsessive. Now they looked precise, practical, almost scientific. The north wall received immediate attention. Samuel mixed small test batches of clay, sand, and ash according to Peter's recorded ratios. He repaired only damaged sections and carefully documented every step. Nothing hidden, nothing altered, everything photographed, everything logged. Maren helped where she could. The work felt strangely personal. Each layer of plaster revealed more about Peter, not the stubborn fool Samuel had imagined. A craftsman, a man who solved problems with patience instead of speeches, a man who kept records because he knew someday someone would doubt him. That realization hurt. Because Samuel had been one of those people. 3 days later, another visitor arrived. Professor Henry Keene, a building historian from Wichita. Maren had arranged the introduction. Keene specialized in early prairie structures and historic preservation. He spent hours inspecting the cabin, measuring walls, examining plaster layers, checking moisture levels, taking notes. Unlike Warren, he rarely spoke while working. Late in the afternoon, he finally stood beside the north wall. Interesting. Samuel looked up. What is? Keene pointed toward the repaired section, then toward a different area several feet away. This patch. Samuel moved closer. The historian traced a narrow rectangle hidden beneath an older plaster layer. The outline was almost invisible. Almost. What about it? Keene tapped gently against the surface. A dull sound answered, different from the surrounding wall, different enough. His eyes narrowed. This wasn't part of the original construction. Samuel's pulse quickened. Meaning, it was sealed later. How much later? Keene considered the question. Hard to say without opening it. Maren exchanged a glance with Samuel. Both understood the problem. Opening the wall risked damaging evidence. Leaving it untouched risked losing it if the county condemned the structure. Keene seemed to understand their hesitation. Document everything first. Samuel nodded. That evening they photographed the area from every angle. measurements, material samples, location references, everything. Only after finishing did Samuel carefully begin removing a small section of deteriorated plaster. The process took nearly an hour. Nobody rushed, nobody spoke much. The cavity finally appeared just before sunset, smaller than the first one, narrower, deliberate. Samuel reached inside. His fingers touched oilcloth. His heart immediately started pounding. Slowly he pulled the bundle free. Dust drifted through the orange evening light. The package looked old, very old, older than the first one. For several seconds, nobody moved. Marin broke the silence. "Open it." Samuel carefully unfolded the brittle wrapping. Inside lay several folded papers, a rough sketch, a few handwritten notes, and one sealed envelope. His father's handwriting covered the front, not Amos. Peter. The envelope carried only 3 words. For Samuel. No date, no explanation, no indication Peter had ever intended anyone else to see it. Samuel stared at the envelope. The world seemed to narrow around it. The wind moved softly across Cedar Draw. The cabin remained silent, and for the first time since returning home, Samuel realized his father may have known exactly what would happen after he was gone. Samuel did not open the envelope immediately. The fading sunlight painted long shadows across the cabin floor while he stared at his father's handwriting. For years he had imagined dozens of conversations they never had, arguments, explanations, apologies. Now one of those conversations might finally be waiting inside a piece of paper hidden behind a wall. Marin sat quietly nearby. Professor Keene packed away his tools and respectfully moved toward the door. "No matter what's in there," he said, "document it before anyone else touches it." Samuel nodded. The historian left. Only Samuel and Marin remained. With careful hands, Samuel photographed the envelope front and back. The seal had yellowed with age but remained intact. Peter had hidden it well. Too well, almost as if he had expected someone to search for it. Finally, Samuel slid a small knife beneath the flap. The paper crackled softly. Inside were 4 folded pages. The first line hit harder than he expected. "If you're reading this, then the wall held longer than I did." Samuel closed his eyes for a moment. That sounded exactly like Peter. Not dramatic, not sentimental, practical, the letter continued. Peter explained that he never expected Samuel to understand the cabin while he was alive. He knew people laughed at it. He knew most of Cedar Draw considered it proof of failure. He also knew Samuel had spent years trying to escape the reputation attached to the property. But Peter wrote that the cabin had never been built simply because he was poor. It had been built because he had been cornered. Samuel read slowly. After Amos Vale died, Peter discovered that portions of the estate records no longer matched conversations Amos had privately shared with him. Certain boundary descriptions seemed different. Water references had disappeared. Survey markers had moved. Peter suspected something was wrong, but suspicion was not proof, and Caleb controlled nearly every relationship that mattered in Cedar Draw: lenders, contractors, seasonal labor, political connections. Peter wrote that challenging Caleb publicly without evidence would have ruined him completely. So instead he stayed quiet. He watched, he collected records, he waited. Samuel lowered the pages. The room felt smaller. All those years he had believed Peter simply refused to move on. Instead, Peter had been living inside a trap. Marin studied his expression. "What does it say?" Samuel handed her the letter. She read in silence. By the second page her face had changed. Not surprise, sadness, the kind that arrives when a puzzle suddenly becomes human. Peter described the years after the estate division. Banks repeatedly rejected financing requests. Property improvements were delayed. Access roads somehow remained unfinished. The northern tract everyone called worthless became the only land Peter could realistically keep. So he adapted. Instead of building a traditional farmhouse, he studied old prairie construction methods: straw bale walls, lime plaster, deep drainage trenches, natural insulation, cheap materials, strong protection. People laughed. Peter let them laugh. Because surviving mattered more than winning arguments. Samuel stared around the cabin. For the first time he saw it differently, not as evidence of defeat, as evidence of resistance. The next pages contained sketches, temperature records, drainage notes, weather observations. The same careful handwriting covered everything. Then another section appeared. Peter's tone changed. "If Caleb ever loses control of the story, look for the drainage sketch." Samuel immediately unfolded the rough drawing found inside the oilcloth packet. Marin leaned closer. Several lines crossed the property. Small notes appeared beside them. Most were technical observations: runoff direction, snow accumulation, spring flooding, but one notation stood apart, a single signature: Silas Pruitt, the same name Samuel had discovered earlier. "What does that mean?" Marin asked. "I don't know." But Samuel suspected he soon would. The following morning he drove to the county archive before opening hours. Marin was already waiting outside. She had spent part of the night researching. "I found something," she said. Inside the records room she spread several photocopies across a table. One document immediately caught Samuel's attention: a probate receipt, dated 3 days before Amos's estate reading. The signature at the bottom belonged to a surveyor. Another signature appeared beside it: Caleb Vale. Samuel stared at it. The timing was impossible to ignore. 3 days before the estate distribution. 3 days before property boundaries became official. 3 days before Peter's future changed. "Can we prove what the payment was for?" Samuel asked. "Not yet." The answer frustrated him again. Always another step, always another missing piece. Marin tapped a line near the bottom, but this surveyor worked independently. His records might still exist somewhere. Samuel felt the investigation shifting. The story was no longer trapped inside family memories. Paper trails existed, documents existed, witnesses existed. Caleb had left footprints. The question was whether enough remained to follow them. That afternoon Warren arrived at the cabin uninvited. He found Samuel repairing part of the drainage trench surrounding the foundation. The older man watched for several moments before speaking. "You really think this place matters?" "It wasn't a question," Samuel continued working. "More every day." Warren laughed. "The cabin isn't history, it's embarrassment." Samuel stood slowly. For years those words would have landed. "Not anymore. That's what your family keeps saying." Warren's expression tightened. "My family built this county." "No," Samuel replied quietly. "People built this county. Some just got credit for it." The silence between them felt sharp. Warren stepped closer. "You need to stop digging." There it was. Not a joke, not a casual suggestion. A warning. Samuel met his eyes. "Why?" Warren hesitated, only for a second, but Samuel noticed. Because Warren didn't have an answer he wanted spoken aloud. Instead he pulled an envelope from his coat. A check. Large enough to solve several of Samuel's immediate problems. Large enough to pay debts. Large enough to make walking away tempting. "Sell me the property," Warren said. Samuel looked at the number, then handed it back. No, for the first time Warren appeared genuinely angry. Not amused, not dismissive, afraid. He left without another word. The truck disappeared down the road in a cloud of dust. Samuel watched it go. Marin arrived less than an hour later carrying another box of copied documents. She looked troubled. "Something happened?" Warren offered money. Her expression darkened. "That's not good." "No, because people didn't offer that much money to protect worthless property. They offered it to protect valuable secrets." As evening approached, Samuel returned to Peter's letter. One final paragraph remained unread. He unfolded the last page. The handwriting seemed hurried compared to the rest. "If anything happens to me before I finish proving it, find the witness. The map alone won't be enough." Silas saw what Caleb changed. Samuel's eyes moved lower. A location appeared beneath the sentence. Not an address, not a town, a name, the name of a ranch long abandoned outside Cedar Draw. And beside it, Peter had written 6 words that made Samuel's pulse spike. Silas hid the original under stone. Samuel barely slept. The name of the abandoned ranch sat on the table beside Peter's letter all night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the same sentence. Silas hid the original under stone. Not a copy, not a note, the original. If Peter had been right, then somewhere outside Cedar Draw, hidden for decades, might be the document that connected everything together. At sunrise, Samuel called Marin. 2 hours later, they were driving west along a neglected county road that seemed determined to disappear into the prairie. The abandoned ranch had once belonged to the Pruitt family before drought and debt forced its closure generations earlier. Most of the structures were gone now. Only fragments remained: a collapsed windmill, a leaning corral, a stone foundation half swallowed by weeds. The place felt forgotten, which made it a perfect hiding place. Samuel parked near the remains of the old bunkhouse. Wind moved through the grass. Nothing else moved. For a moment neither spoke. Then Marin unfolded a copy of Peter's drainage sketch. Where would a surveyor hide something? Samuel looked around. Somewhere that survives weather, stone. He nodded. They began searching. The first hour produced nothing except rusted metal and broken fence hardware. The second yielded an old horseshoe and several loose foundation rocks. By noon, frustration was replacing optimism. Samuel sat on a fallen beam and studied the sketch again. Something bothered him. The drainage lines, the arrows, the orientation. Then suddenly he stood. "What is it?" Marin asked. He pointed toward the remains of the windmill. "The map isn't showing water flow." She frowned. "It isn't?" "No." He traced one line with his finger. "It's showing landmarks." The realization hit hard. Peter had disguised directions as drainage notes. Anyone casually reading the sketch would assume it was construction information. But someone familiar with surveying would notice the pattern. Samuel walked toward the windmill. The structure had collapsed decades earlier. Only the circular stone base remained. Several large rocks surrounded it. One stood apart from the others, not because of its size, because of its placement, too deliberate, too symmetrical. Samuel crouched beside it, his pulse quickened. The stone shifted when he pushed. Not much, just enough. Marin immediately saw it too. Together they lifted. Beneath the stone sat a narrow cavity. Inside rested a rusted metal box. Neither moved for several seconds. The box looked exactly like something a cautious man would bury when he expected trouble. Samuel carefully removed it. The lid resisted at first, then opened. Inside were folded papers wrapped in oilcloth, a notebook, and something neither expected. A sealed letter addressed directly to Silas Pruitt. The handwriting belonged to Amos Vale. For a long moment the prairie disappeared. The wind disappeared. Only the box remained. Because suddenly this wasn't just Peter's investigation anymore. Amos himself had been involved. Back at the archive, they photographed everything before touching a page. The notebook belonged to Silas. Construction notes filled much of it. Measurements, weather observations, repair records. Then the entries changed. Samuel turned pages carefully. The words became personal, private, specific. Silas described conversations with Peter during the months following Amos's death. He wrote about boundary markers, missing survey stakes, arguments never made public, repeated concerns that official maps no longer matched older field measurements. Each entry pushed the same conclusion. Peter had not imagined the discrepancies. Others had noticed them too. Samuel continued reading, then he stopped. A paragraph near the middle tightened his chest. "Caleb says Peter sees ghosts in numbers. Yet he asked me twice whether I remembered where the original watermark stood. Men only ask such questions when they already know the answer." Marin slowly exhaled. "That's bad. It gets worse." Several pages later, Silas documented a meeting involving Caleb, a surveyor, and 2 local landowners. Silas had not attended, but he recorded what others reported. The timing matched the receipt Samuel had found. 3 days before the estate division. Exactly 3, not proof, not yet, but enough to deepen the pattern. Then they opened Amos's sealed letter. The paper was fragile, the ink faded, yet every word remained readable. Samuel's hands trembled slightly. Amos wrote that his health was failing. He feared disputes after his death. He specifically mentioned disagreements between his sons regarding land use, water access, and future expansion. Then came the sentence neither expected. "If the north rise is separated from the water route, the survey is false." Samuel looked up. Marin stared back. Neither spoke. Because Amos had just described the exact issue Peter spent decades trying to prove. The letter continued. Amos explained that the northern rise possessed strategic value during severe winters. Snowdrift patterns protected portions of the ground. Drainage remained stable. Livestock shelter could survive conditions that damaged lower acreage. It was not worthless land. It never had been. The story Caleb spent decades telling suddenly looked manufactured. But Amos never directly accused Caleb. That absence mattered. Legally, historically, emotionally. The letter established intent, not guilt. Samuel understood the distinction immediately, and so would anyone reviewing the evidence. By evening they finished cataloging everything. Samuel stepped outside the archive. The sky above Cedar Draw glowed orange. For the first time since returning home, he felt close to understanding Peter. Not the stubborn man everyone described, the patient man, the one who spent years preserving evidence instead of chasing revenge. The realization hurt. Because Samuel had spent much of his adult life believing the wrong story, his phone rang. Warren. Samuel considered ignoring it. Instead, he answered. "Found anything interesting?" Warren asked. The question came too quickly, too casually. Samuel said nothing. Warren laughed softly. "You know what's funny? Everyone thinks you're digging up history." Another pause. "But history isn't what scares people." The line grew quiet. Then Warren continued. "My grandfather told me something before he died." Samuel felt tension tighten across his shoulders. What did he say? A long silence followed. Long enough to feel deliberate. Finally Warren spoke. He said there was one document nobody could ever find. The words landed heavily, because Warren shouldn't have known that. Not unless someone in Caleb's family knew exactly what had been hidden. Samuel's voice hardened. "What document?" But Warren ignored the question. Instead he said something far worse. "If you're smart, you'll stop before you find out why Caleb was really afraid of Peter." The call disconnected. Samuel stared at the dark screen. A cold feeling settled into his stomach. Because Warren no longer sounded like a man protecting family pride. He sounded like a man protecting something much bigger. 20 minutes later, Samuel returned inside the archive. Maren was waiting beside the newly catalogued materials. She looked pale. "What's wrong?" Samuel asked. Without speaking, she slid a photocopy across the table. It had been tucked inside Amos's letter. Missed during the first review, a folded attachment, a fragment of an older survey map. Samuel immediately noticed the marking, a red X, near the water route. Beside it, Amos had written 6 words in faded pencil. "Ask Elias who moved the marker." Samuel stared at the name Reverend Elias Crow, the town minister whose family had preserved church records for over a century. The same family that had witnessed nearly every major land transfer in Cedar Draw. And suddenly Samuel understood something terrifying. The secret had never belonged only to the Vale family. Other people had known, and someone had spent decades making sure they stayed silent. Samuel drove to the Crow family church the next morning under a gray Kansas sky that threatened snow. The building stood on a low rise east of Cedar Draw. It was older than most structures in the county. Older than the foundation that now carried the Vale name. Older than many of the stories people repeated as fact. If Amos Vale had written Reverend Elias Crow's name beside that red X, there had to be a reason. The current minister, Daniel Crow, greeted Samuel cautiously. He was in his 60s and carried the same steady manner Samuel remembered from funeral services years ago. When Samuel mentioned Amos Vale's letter, the minister's expression changed immediately. Not fear. Recognition. "You should come inside," Daniel said. That answer alone told Samuel he was in the right place. The church archive occupied a narrow room behind the sanctuary. Shelves lined the walls. Decades of records sat inside carefully labeled boxes. Baptisms, marriages, land donations, community relief funds. Churches kept records when nobody else bothered. Daniel closed the door. "Tell me exactly what you've found." Samuel did. The hidden page, the survey discrepancies, the Pruitt notebook, the buried box, Amos's letter. The minister listened without interruption. When Samuel finished, Daniel remained silent for several moments. Then he walked toward a filing cabinet in the corner. "I hoped this would never matter again." The statement landed heavily, not because of what it said, because of what it implied. Daniel removed a worn ledger book, not a church ledger, a personal journal. "My grandfather Elias kept this." Samuel leaned forward. The minister opened several pages near the middle. Names appeared. Dates, property descriptions, weather observations, then a specific entry. February 1891. Elias described a private meeting involving Caleb Vale, a surveyor, and 2 county officials. The entry was frustratingly brief. No direct accusations, no dramatic confession. Just observations, yet one sentence stood out. Caleb insisted the replacement marker reflected the original line. Peter refused to agree. Samuel's pulse quickened. Replacement marker, not original marker. The distinction mattered. Daniel nodded. "That's the same phrase my grandfather used several times." Did he explain it? No. The answer felt like another door partially opening. Never fully. Always another layer. Daniel turned several more pages. Most contained ordinary community matters. Then another reference appeared. Elias had visited Peter's cabin after a severe winter storm. He wrote that Peter showed him old maps and survey sketches. Peter believed the water route had been shifted on paper long after Amos made his intentions clear. Again, the same story. Different witness, independent source. The pattern was growing stronger, but not yet strong enough. Samuel knew that, so did Daniel. The minister closed the journal. My grandfather wasn't a man who exaggerated. No, but he was a man who avoided public fights. Samuel almost laughed. That sounded familiar. Everyone who knew the truth seemed to spend decades staying quiet. The cost of silence stretched across generations. As Samuel prepared to leave, Daniel hesitated. Then he opened another drawer. Inside sat a small photograph. The image showed several adults standing outside the church nearly a century earlier. Time had faded most details, but Samuel immediately recognized two faces from family photographs, Amos, Peter. Several others stood nearby. One of them was Caleb. The photo itself proved nothing, until Samuel looked closer. Then he noticed what Daniel had already seen. Every person in the image faced the camera, except Caleb. His attention was directed toward a wooden survey marker standing near the edge of the frame. The same marker marked with a faint painted stripe, a stripe matching the notation shown on Amos's survey fragment. Samuel stared. Can we date this? Daniel nodded. The church anniversary celebration, the dates documented. If verified, the photograph placed the marker in a specific location before the disputed survey revisions. Not enough to settle a legal dispute, but enough to raise new questions. Questions Warren would not like. By afternoon, Samuel returned to the archive. Marin listened carefully as he described everything. The photograph interested her most, not because it proved anything directly, because it connected separate sources. Church records, personal journals, survey sketches, family letters. Independent evidence was beginning to overlap. Exactly what investigators looked for, exactly what people hiding something feared. That evening, another problem arrived. A certified envelope. The return address belonged to attorneys representing the Vale Historical Foundation. Samuel opened it immediately. The letter informed him that Warren had formally requested authority to review and reclaim all foundation-related materials connected to the cabin, including archive documents, photographs, correspondence, and any records involving family land disputes. Marin read over his shoulder. He wants everything. He wants control. The difference mattered, because whoever controlled the documents controlled the story. Samuel understood the move instantly. Warren wasn't trying to win with facts. He was trying to bury access again. The same strategy Caleb appeared to have used decades earlier. Different generation. Same playbook. Samuel folded the letter, then made a decision. Instead of waiting, he contacted a preservation historian at the state university, not for publicity, not for advocacy, for documentation. If evidence disappeared locally, certified copies elsewhere would survive. By nightfall, digital scans were being prepared. Multiple backs, multiple locations. The truth was becoming harder to erase, which meant the pressure would increase. The next morning proved it. Someone had entered the cabin overnight. The front door showed no damage. Nothing obvious had been stolen. Yet Samuel immediately sensed something was wrong. The interior felt disturbed. Small details, subtle changes, the kind only someone spending weeks inside the structure would notice. A chair moved, a notebook shifted, a storage crate slightly open. He walked directly toward the north wall. The repaired section remained intact. Nothing appeared missing. Then he noticed the dust, fresh footprints. Not many, just enough. Someone had searched, carefully, methodically, and recently. Marin arrived 20 minutes later. Together they inspected every room. Finally, Samuel found what the intruder missed. Beneath Peter's old work table, tucked between two loose floorboards, a folded piece of paper. The edges were yellow. The handwriting belonged to Peter. It wasn't a letter. It wasn't a diary entry. It looked more like a reminder, a note written quickly and hidden deliberately. Only one sentence appeared on it. If they come looking, they already know about the second map. Samuel froze. Marin stared at the paper. Neither spoke, because until that moment they had believed there was only one missing survey version. One altered boundary, one hidden truth. Now Peter's own handwriting suggested something far more dangerous. There had been a second map, and somewhere, someone still knew exactly where it was. I'll continue the story in the requested format. Samuel read the note 3 times before he folded it and slipped it into a protective sleeve. The words were simple. If they come looking, they already know about the second map. Nothing else, no date, no explanation, no clue about where Peter had hidden it. Yet the sentence changed everything. For weeks, Samuel had assumed the missing ledger pages and altered survey records were the center of the mystery. Now it appeared those documents might only have been pieces of something larger. Marin understood it immediately. Whoever entered this cabin wasn't searching randomly. Samuel nodded. They knew exactly what they were looking for. The realization sat heavily between them. Someone believed a second map still existed. Someone believed Peter had hidden it. And someone had been willing to break into the cabin to find it. That afternoon, Samuel stopped treating the cabin like a family property. He started treating it like an evidence site. He photographed every room again, every wall, every repair, every storage space. Then he compared the images with older photographs he had taken weeks earlier. Most showed nothing unusual. One did. A narrow shelf beside the old stove had been disturbed. The change was small, almost invisible, but Samuel spent his professional life studying structures and preservation details. He noticed things other people missed. The shelf held several jars containing nails, wire fragments, and miscellaneous hardware Peter had collected over the years. One jar now sat several inches farther back than before. Samuel removed it carefully, nothing. Then he checked the board beneath it. The wood sounded different, hollow. His pulse quickened. Marin grabbed a flashlight. Together they examined the shelf. A hidden compartment revealed itself after several minutes. Not sophisticated, just clever. The kind of hiding place a practical man would build using scraps already available. Inside rested a folded sheet of paper. Samuel's hands tightened. For a moment he thought they had found the map. They hadn't. The paper contained a list, names, dates, locations. Several entries referenced old boundary markers around Cedar Draw. Others referenced church records, survey corners, witnesses. The final entry stood apart from the rest. Elias Crow, copy retained. Samuel looked up. Marin was already thinking the same thing. The minister, he might have something else. Neither wasted time. They drove directly to the church. Daniel Crow looked increasingly troubled as Samuel showed him Peter's list. The minister stared at the final line for nearly a minute. Then he disappeared into the archive room. When he returned, he carried a thin wooden box. "I didn't know this mattered." His voice sounded uncertain. "Grandfather told me never to throw it away." Daniel placed the box on the table. Inside lay several letters. Most were ordinary church correspondence. One wasn't. The envelope bore Amos Vale's handwriting. Unopened. Daniel frowned. "I've never read it." Samuel carefully examined the seal. It had never been broken. For more than a century, the room felt suddenly smaller. Daniel gave permission. Samuel opened it. Inside was a single page. Amos's writing appeared shaky, likely written near the end of his life. The message was brief. "If disagreement continues after my death, Reverend Crow shall hold the duplicate survey until all parties agree to independent review." Duplicate survey, not second map. Duplicate survey. The distinction mattered. A duplicate implied an official version, a verified version, potentially the version Caleb never wanted anyone to see. Samuel's heart hammered. "Where is it?" he asked. Daniel looked genuinely confused. There wasn't anything else in the box. For several seconds nobody spoke. Then Marin pointed toward the bottom of the letter. A notation appeared beneath Amos's signature. 3 words, stored separately below. Samuel immediately searched the box again. Nothing. Daniel checked every compartment. Nothing. Then the minister's face slowly changed. Below. "What?" "My grandfather's desk." The old desk still sat in storage beneath the church. A massive oak structure nobody used anymore. Within minutes they were downstairs. Dust covered everything. Years of forgotten church furniture filled the room. Daniel located the desk. It weighed nearly enough to require all 3 of them to move it. Samuel inspected every drawer. Nothing. Then he examined the underside. A false panel. Hidden so well it might have remained unnoticed for another 100 years. The panel opened. Inside rested a rolled document wrapped in cloth. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Samuel carefully removed it. His hands trembled despite every effort to stay calm. The cloth had darkened with age. The paper inside remained remarkably intact. A survey map, an original survey map. Signed, dated, witnessed. The room went silent. Samuel spread it across a table. Immediately he saw the difference. The water route, the north rise, the disputed acreage. Everything matched the clues scattered through the ledger pages, witness notebooks, and Amos's letters. Peter's tract wasn't barren, it never had been. The corrected boundary gave direct access to the safest winter ground and seasonal water flow, the exact resources Caleb's version had reassigned elsewhere. For the first time, Samuel held physical proof that the family story had been manipulated. Not rumor, not memory, not interpretation, proof, but even proof raised new questions. Maren studied the signatures. Then she frowned. Samuel, he looked up. She pointed toward the witness section. There were 3 signatures, Amos Vale the surveyor, and a third name, a name neither of them expected. Not Elias Crow, not Silas Pruitt, not Peter. The witness signature belonged to Judge Henry Mercer. Samuel stared. The name felt familiar, very familiar. Then he remembered. Henry Mercer had presided over Amos Vale's estate proceedings, the same proceedings where the disputed land division had supposedly become official. The room grew quiet again, because the implication was impossible to ignore. If Judge Mercer had witnessed the corrected survey before Amos died, then someone involved in the estate process had known the truth from the beginning. Someone with legal authority, someone whose records should still exist, someone whose silence had helped bury Peter's claim for generations. Maren slowly lowered the map. Samuel, he already understood, the fraud might have been bigger than Caleb. Much bigger. And somewhere in the county records, there might still be evidence showing exactly who helped make Peter disappear from his own inheritance. Then Daniel noticed something none of them had seen. A notation written faintly in the survey's lower corner, not part of the original survey, added later in different ink, only 6 words, Judge Copy filed under Mercer. Samuel felt the blood drain from his face. Because the Mercer judicial records had never been transferred to the county archive. They remained locked inside a private collection owned by Judge Mercer's surviving descendants, and one of those descendants sat on the board of the Vale Historical Foundation. Samuel barely slept that night. The restored survey lay locked inside a fireproof case in Maren's office, while certified digital copies sat on 3 separate drives. For the first time since returning to Cedar Draw, he felt something close to confidence. That feeling lasted until sunrise. His phone rang just after 6. Maren sounded exhausted. They filed an emergency request. Samuel sat upright. Who? The foundation board. His stomach tightened. Warren? He convinced 2 members to support a special review. They're claiming the Mercer survey can't be authenticated until the Mercer family records are examined. Samuel already knew what that meant. Delay. Confusion, time, the same tools Caleb had used generations earlier. By mid-morning, Samuel and Maren were standing outside a large Victorian house near the edge of town, the Mercer residence. Unlike the weathered farms around Cedar Draw, the property looked untouched by hardship. Fresh paint, perfect landscaping, new vehicles. Money had survived here. History had survived too. Whether truth had survived was another question. The door opened before they knocked. Evelyn Mercer greeted them cautiously. She was in her 70s, sharp-eyed and clearly aware of why they had come. I expected you sooner, she said. Samuel exchanged a glance with Maren. That was not the response he expected. Evelyn led them into a study filled with old legal volumes and framed photographs. No one wasted time. Samuel showed her a copy of the survey. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she closed her eyes. Henry should have destroyed that. The words hit harder than Samuel expected. Not because they confirmed wrongdoing, because they confirmed knowledge. She knew exactly what the document was. Maren leaned forward. You're familiar with it? Evelyn nodded slowly. My grandfather talked about it once. The room became silent. Samuel forced himself to stay calm. What did he say? Evelyn stared at the survey again. He said there were 2 versions. One was right, one was convenient. No one spoke. Outside, wind rattled tree branches against the window. Evelyn finally stood and walked toward a locked cabinet. She hesitated before opening it. Samuel saw conflict on her face. Family loyalty, reputation, fear, all fighting against each other. When the cabinet opened, she removed a leather-bound journal. My grandfather kept notes. She placed it carefully on the table. I never let anyone see this. Samuel opened the journal. Most entries involved court schedules and property disputes. Then he found a section marked with a familiar date, the period immediately after Amos Vale's death. His pulse quickened. Henry Mercer's notes were detailed, painfully detailed. Several pages described disagreements over survey boundaries, witness statements, private meetings, concerns about family pressure. Then one sentence stopped Samuel cold. Caleb insists public correction would damage the family's future. Samuel read it twice, then 3 times. It wasn't proof of fraud by itself, but it changed everything. For decades the story had been that Peter inherited poor land because circumstances left no better option. Now there was evidence that someone had understood the correction might never become public, not accidentally, deliberately. Marin carefully photographed each page. Evelyn watched in silence. Finally she spoke. "You should know something else." Samuel looked up. "My grandfather regretted something." What? He believed Amos intended to announce the correction himself. Samuel frowned, "But he died before the estate meeting." "Yes." Evelyn's voice softened. "And after he died, everyone started choosing sides." The words lingered. Everyone started choosing sides. Not just Caleb. Not just Peter, everyone. For the first time Samuel understood how the lie had survived so long. Not because one man controlled everything. Because too many people found silence easier than conflict. The realization hurt. Especially when he thought about Peter. Years of ridicule. Years of isolation. Years spent defending a straw bale cabin everyone mocked, not because he lacked proof, because proof had been buried under generations of convenience. Then Evelyn revealed something unexpected. "There may be another record." Samuel froze. "What kind of record?" "A hearing transcript." Marin immediately looked up. "A transcript?" Evelyn nodded. "My grandfather mentioned one private meeting involving Amos, Caleb the surveyor and 2 witnesses. Samuel's heartbeat accelerated. "If a transcript exists, where is it?" Evelyn shook her head. "I don't know." The disappointment arrived instantly. Then she added something else. "But I know who searched for it." Samuel felt every muscle tighten. "Who? Warren." The room went silent. Not Caleb. Not decades ago, Warren. Recently, within the last few years. The implication was impossible to ignore. Warren had known there might be records beyond the official estate file. He had been searching before Samuel ever returned to Kansas, before the break-in, before the sabotage, before the demolition attempt. Samuel suddenly saw the pattern. Warren wasn't reacting to discoveries. He had been anticipating them. The man had spent years trying to find and contain evidence before anyone else could. Marin seemed to reach the same conclusion. When did he ask? Evelyn thought for a moment. About 3 years ago. Samuel felt his pulse quicken again. 3 years, long before Peter died, long before Samuel inherited anything, which raised a far more disturbing question. Why had Warren been searching then? What had he already found? The answer came unexpectedly. Evelyn crossed the room and opened a drawer. From inside she removed a faded envelope. The paper looked decades old, unmailed, unopened. She handed it to Samuel. "It was delivered to my grandfather anonymously." Samuel examined the front. No return address, only a handwritten note. For the record, carefully he opened it. Inside was a single photograph, black and white. The image showed 4 adults standing beside survey markers on open prairie land. Amos stood in the center. The surveyor stood beside him. One witness matched a photograph Samuel had already seen of Silas Pruitt, but the 4th person changed everything. Samuel recognized him immediately, not because of history books, not because of family stories, because the face looked astonishingly familiar. The man in the photograph shared the same eyes, the same jawline, the same expression Samuel had seen countless times during foundation meetings. He slowly turned the picture toward Marin. Her face drained of color. Neither needed to say the name aloud. The 4th witness was clearly related to one of the current foundation board members. And if that witness had stood beside Amos during the corrected survey, then an entire branch of Cedar Draw's leadership had known the truth for generations. On the back of the photograph, written in fading ink, were 6 words. Not all witnesses remained silent, and beneath those words was a signature, one Samuel had never seen before. But Marin had. She stared at it for several seconds, then looked at Samuel. "I know exactly who this was." The signature belonged to Thomas Reed, not a judge, not a surveyor, a schoolteacher, a quiet local historian whose journals had been donated decades earlier to the county archive. Marin recognized the name because she had catalogued the collection herself. The discovery changed everything. Within days, Reed's journals were reviewed alongside the Mercer notes, the corrected survey, Silas Pruitt's notebooks, the missing ledger pages, and the documents recovered from beneath the stove brick. Individually, none of them told the entire story. Together they formed a record too consistent to dismiss. The evidence showed that Amos Vale had intended the corrected boundary to stand. It showed that the North Rise and Water route belonged with Peter's tract. It showed repeated efforts to preserve that information, and it showed how those efforts vanished after Amos died. Warren's eventual admission about destroying a ledger page was not treated as the deciding piece. It became only one more part of a much larger pattern. The probate mediator reviewed the trust records. Independent historians authenticated the notebooks. A preservation engineer verified the cabin's original construction and documented the recent sabotage. County archive copies confirmed the missing ledger sequence. Months of review replaced generations of rumor. The final conclusions arrived quietly. No dramatic courtroom, no sudden confession, just documented findings, signed reports, and votes that could no longer ignore the truth. The Vale Historical Foundation removed Warren from its board. His authority over the preservation fund ended immediately. The proposed land sale was cancelled because the acreage under dispute could not legally be transferred under the foundation's previous claims. A structured settlement required repayment of improperly managed trust income connected to the disputed property. For the first time in decades, Warren could not control the narrative. The records were digitized, archived, copied, placed into county custody. The story no longer belonged to one family branch, it belonged to history. Warren met Samuel only once after the decision. The meeting happened outside the foundation office. No lawyers, no audience, just two men standing in winter wind. Warren looked older than Samuel remembered. Smaller too, not because he had lost money, because he had lost certainty. "My grandfather built this town," Warren said quietly. Samuel shook his head. "No." Warren frowned. Samuel looked toward the distant prairie. "People built this town. Peter helped build it too. You just didn't want his name next to Caleb's." For a long moment Warren said nothing. Then he nodded once. Not agreement, not surrender, just recognition. The conversation ended there. Samuel never tried to repair the relationship. Some damage required distance. Some truths could heal without creating friendship. Spring arrived slowly across Cedar Draw. Work began on the cabin, not as a private monument, not as a tourist attraction, as a learning site. A place where people could understand what had actually happened. Nora helped organize the historical exhibits. Marin supervised archival materials and preservation records. Together they assembled the story Peter had spent a lifetime protecting. One display contained Amos's corrected survey, another contained Silas Pruitt's testimony about the blizzard, a third displayed Elena's trade notes and weather observations. At the center stood Peter's measurements, temperatures, wind direction, wall thickness, moisture readings, page after page of practical knowledge. Nothing glamorous, nothing dramatic, just evidence of a man who understood survival better than anyone had given him credit for. Visitors arrived throughout the summer. Some came because of the controversy, others because of the unusual construction. Many left surprised. The straw bale cabin they expected to laugh at turned out to be one of the most carefully documented structures in the region. Peter's reputation changed slowly, which made it feel real. No miracle transformed him into a legend overnight, but people stopped calling him a fool. They started calling him what he had actually been: a builder, an observer, a stubborn pioneer innovator who refused to abandon land everyone else misunderstood. Samuel received stewardship rights over the cabin and surrounding site. He did not become wealthy. The partial restitution mostly funded preservation work and long-term maintenance, but wealth no longer felt important. He had spent years believing his father wasted his life defending a mistake. Now he understood Peter had been defending the truth. Late that winter, after the restoration was complete, Samuel spent a night alone inside the cabin. The same cabin he had nearly sold. The same cabin Warren had tried to demolish. The same cabin that had hidden the evidence long enough to survive. Outside, Kansas wind swept across the prairie. Inside, the thick walls remained steady. Warm, quiet. Samuel sat beside the old stove and opened Amos's ledger. The pages no longer felt like evidence, they felt like voices. He read Peter's weather notes aloud. Not for visitors, not for reporters, not for historians, just for himself. The measurement sounded almost ordinary: temperatures, snow depth, wind shifts, but beneath every line he heard something else: determination, patience, refusal. The cabin had never been built from poverty alone. It had been built from resistance. Resistance to freezing, resistance to surrender, resistance to letting Caleb own the story. Hours later, Samuel stood and walked to the door. The cracked thermometer Peter had once used rested on a nearby table. Carefully, he hung it back in its original place. Then he opened the ledger one final time. Beneath Peter's last recorded entry, Samuel added a single line: North Wall held. So did his name. He closed the book. Outside, the winter wind continued across Cedar Draw, but it never entered the cabin, and for the first time in many years, neither did the lie. If you had been in Samuel's place, would you have fought for the truth or walked away? Feel free to share your thoughts below.